have been discussing our various conceptual theories regarding epistemology, and we will be picking up yet another interesting topic today, and that is on radical skepticism and closure. Though discussions on radical skepticism and closure had already started in our previous lecture, we continue more today. This paper, Epistemology, has been introduced by the Delhi University for the 6th semester students, Philosophy Honours, DSC 18. This is Dr. Ananya Barwa, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, when we are talking about radical skepticism, we must by now we should be familiar with the name of Duncan Pritchard. Duncan Pritchard's primary readings have been our go-to-go books that we have been referring on and off, and we know that he has written extensively on radical skepticism and the closure principle in epistemology. However, what is interesting is Pritchard's approach is primarily anti-skeptical, focusing on ways to resist radical skepticism while still acknowledging its intuitive appeal. Now, we must understand from the basic. First, what is the challenge? Why is radical skepticism considered a huge challenge? You see, radical skepticism argues that we cannot have knowledge of the external world, and so it is radical, it is not mild. For not having knowledge of the external world would be a world with uncertainty, and they further assert that because we cannot rule out skeptical scenarios like the evil demon, that maybe there is a demon that is being played inside our head, or we are just brains in vats or BIV. So certain terminologies or certain concepts which would be recurring when we are discussing radical skepticism is the BIV or brain in vat. Now, we see that with the skeptical argument, it uses the closure argument. Now, how is skeptical argument connected with closure? The skeptical argument is often presented using the closure principle of knowledge, and the closure principle goes somewhat like this, that if I know P and I know that P entails Q, then I must also know Q. That is to say that if I know Venus and I know that Venus entails both morning star and evening star, then I must also know what morning star and evening star is, because they are implied in P. So, skeptics uses this principle against the module where they say that if I know I have hands, then I must know that I am not a brain in a vat, which is the very simplistic module. But I cannot know that I am a BIV, therefore I do not know that I have hands. Since this reasoning applies to all knowledge of the external world, skepticism threatens to undermine everything we think we know, and this is considered one of the extreme positions of skepticism, which is neither reformative nor milder, but revolutionary in the sense that it is radical. Now, Pritchard thus finds the radical skepticism theory alarming, and he says that a two-step strategy aims or should aim to resist radical skepticism while still accepting the intuitive appeal of the closure principle. So, as such, he is okay with the inherent concept where intuitive appeal of the closure principle is applied in radical skepticism, but he is not okay with the structure of radical skepticism. So, what does Pritchard do? Pritchard does, as discussed, formulates yet another theory on epistemology, which he calls as disjunctivism. Now, perceptual knowledge, he says, is stronger than skeptics assume. And when I see my hands, I don't just have fallible evidence, I have rational access to the fact that I have hands. Now, this direct access means I do not need to rule out the skeptical hypothesis indirectly, which is via inference. The impact, as we can see, is vis-a-vis this argument of perceptual knowledge. It weakens the skeptical argument because knowledge does not rely purely on fallible reasoning but on direct perception of reality. We also see that Pritchard, by rejecting the need for knowledge of anti-skeptical situation, he claims that we do not need to know that skeptical scenarios are false to have knowledge of the external world. I mean, he says that instead our knowledge can be rational even without absolute certainty. So it isn't important that all the time whatever we are speaking or whatever we are stating, it has to be backed by certainty. There can be an element of uncertainty, but as long as they are rational, it should be okay. And he gives an example, like for instance, I do not need to disprove the brain in vat hypothesis to justifiably know that I have hands. So that's okay to have uncertainty, to have a rational claim. And the impact that we see is this allows Pritchard to retain the closure principle while avoiding radical skepticism. Now, if we see this table as displayed in the PPT, Pritchard versus other anti-skeptical strategies, the theory of Mooreanism comes up, where the response to skepticism has been that it simply asserts, I know I have hands, therefore skepticism is false. And to this Pritchard differs, and he says that Pritchard thinks that this is too dogmatic. We need an explanation of why we can reject skepticism. Now, contextualism, the response to skepticism about no, means different things in different contexts. We do know in everyday cases, but not in skeptical ones. Now, how Pritchard differs? Pritchard rejects contextual shifts, that he says that knowledge should be stable. It cannot be shifting from one context to the other. Otherwise, the very definition of knowledge becomes self-defeating. Further, we also have this theory called reliabilism, where response to skepticism is that knowledge does not require ruling out all skeptical scenarios, just tracking the truth in normal conditions. Now, how Pritchard differs? Pritchard thinks this justification offers a better explanation of perceptual knowledge. And it is interesting to note that all these three theories, Mooreanism of G.E. Moore, contextualism of D. Rose or Cohen, reliabilism of Dretske or Nozick, they have their own typical responses to skepticism, and Pritchard gives an alternative, and he suggests a better way out, which he thinks should be our disjunctivism. Now, what do we then understand, or what are the key takeaways of Pritchard's key contributions? We see that Pritchard keeps closure argument, but that kind of weakens skepticism's force by showing we do not need to know anti-skeptical claims. Pritchard uses skepticism to argue that perceptual knowledge is stronger than skeptics assume. Thus, he provides a middle ground between dogmatic anti-skepticism and full-blown skepticism. So, we would now be, with this background, check on how Pritchard's anti-skepticism in contemporary debates goes, that is, what is beyond Pritchard's disjunctivism. Now, in the field of AI or virtual reality and simulation skepticism, it is interesting to note that Pritchard's response to radical skepticism is especially his epistemological disjunctivism and his defense of perceptual knowledge has had significant implications for modern debates on AI, virtual reality, and the simulation hypothesis. Now we will be discussing some of these in depth. Now, the AI and virtual reality skeptical challenge with we see that with advancements in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, traditional brain in a vat or BIV skepticism has evolved into real world concerns. AI generated realities, that is, if AI can generate ultra realistic simulations, how can we trust that we are not already inside one? So we see that the deep fake skepticism, where if AI can produce indistinguishable deep fakes, how do we trust our perceptual beliefs? Virtual reality skepticism further says that what if our real world is just an advanced simulation? These challenges mirror traditional skepticism by questioning our ability to know the external world. If we cannot rule out the possibility that we live in a highly advanced AI-driven simulation, then how can we truly know anything about reality? Now, Pritchard's disjunctivist response to skepticism can be extended to modern AI and VR-based skeptical challenges. Disjunctivism states that when we genuinely perceive something, our perceptual knowledge is directly connected to reality. In contrast, when we are deceived, we are in a completely different epistemic state, not just a weaker form of knowledge, but something fundamentally distinct. So we see that Pritchard's epistemological disjunctivism against AI skepticism is palpable, where the implication for AI and VR skepticism is if we are not in a simulation, then our perceptual experiences directly connect us to the world, giving us genuine knowledge. If we are in a simulation, then our perception is not a degraded form of knowledge, but something entirely different. Thus, the skeptic's assumption that we must rule out all AI VR deception before claiming knowledge is mistaken. Thus, the result is we can still have real knowledge even if we cannot disprove AI-driven deception scenarios. Now, another modern challenge is AI-generated deep fake skepticism, where AI can fabricate hyper-realistic images, videos, and voices. If AI can fool our senses, how do we trust any perceptual evidence? So, skeptical argument is if I see or hear something, I must know it is not an AI deep fake to claim knowledge. I cannot always tell if something is an AI deep fake, therefore I do not know if my perception is real. So, we do not need to disprove in AI deception cases to trust our knowledge. In normal non-deceptive cases, our perception genuinely tracks reality. Deep fake deception is not part of ordinary perception, but an exceptional case, meaning that the possibility of AI fakes does not undermine all perceptual knowledge. The result thus is AI generated deception is an external risk, not an inherent flaw in perception. Thus, we can still trust most of our knowledge. Now, the simulation hypothesis and Pritchard's anti-skeptical strategy is one of the most important parts here, for we know that one of the most debated AI-based skeptical challenges is Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, which argues 1. If advanced civilization can create perfect simulations of consciousness, then simulated beings would vastly outnumber real ones. 2. If this is the case, we are more likely simulated than real. Skeptical conclusion: we cannot be certain we are in base reality. Pritchard's response, based on disjunctivism and anti-skeptical strategy, is that if we are not in a simulation, then our perceptual knowledge is directly connected to reality. If we are in a simulation, then our experiences are radically different and the skeptical argument collapses because we are not being deceived about our world, we are simply living in a different kind of reality. Thus, either way, we have knowledge of something real, whether it is base real or a simulated one. Thus, the result is that the simulation hypothesis does not lead to skepticism because knowledge is still possible within any consistent reality framework. Thus, then can Pritchard's approach defeat AI or artificial intelligence and virtual reality based skepticism? And this is where our focus has been today, to go beyond disjunctivism, where we are trying to understand Pritchard's response vis-a-vis AI and VR based skepticism. So we had seen that Pritchard's anti-skeptical strategy is highly relevant today as AI, deepfakes and VR raises new epistemological problems. His disjunctivist views allows us to trust our perceptual knowledge without needing to disprove radical skeptical scenarios. He teaches us that reject the demand for absolute certainty, and this is where I think it's a win-win situation. For the disjunctivism, as the very name suggests, is the either or proposition, and where either you can know something with certainty or without uncertainty, and as long as it is rational, it's all fine. So he suggestions to reject the demand for absolute certainty, where we can have justified knowledge without eliminating all skeptical doubts, fills in all the possible methodological gaps. He further provides and says that one needs to apply his insights to modern challenges such as AI deception, VR experience and the simulation hypothesis. And it is here that Pritchard does way better than either Murrianism, contextualism or reliabilism when it comes to going beyond AI and VR based skepticism, for he has given the full space, the full liberty to one, trust one's perceptual knowledge, B, two or second, to reject the demand for absolute certainty, and C or three, to apply one's own discretionary power to contextualized or modern challenges. Now, what is Murrianism and contextualism in relation to skepticism? We see that in epistemology, skepticism raises fundamental doubts about our knowledge of the external world, especially when we are confronted with hypothetical scenarios like BIV or being deceived by an evil demon. Now, philosophers have responded to these challenge in various ways, and two significant approaches are or have been Murrianism and contextualism. Let us explore these theories in detail, considering their philosophical underpinnings, historical context, core theories, strengths, weaknesses, and how Pritchard responds. Murrianism first. Historical context. Murrianism is named after the British philosopher G.E. Moore, who is best known for his common sense approach in philosophy. In 1939, in his seminal essay, Proof of an External World, Moore famously argued that skepticism is self-refuting. The key idea in Murrianism is that we already have knowledge of the external world, and that claims to the contrary, such as a brain in a vat scenario, should be rejected. Moore believed that common sense, ordinary knowledge are more reliable than skeptical hypotheses. Now, Moore's argument, which is the hand argument, that is, I know that I have knowledge for I have hand, where he famously raised his hand and stated, here is one hand and here is another, asserting that he knows that he has two hands. And the argument goes that if we know this, then we know the existence of the external world, because these hands are part of the external world. Moore's assertion of knowledge based on common sense, which is knowing I have hands, directly conflicts with the skeptical premise that we cannot know anything about the external world. So Moore said, here is one hand and here is another, and to show the knowledge of ordinary objects, it is self-evident. In contrast to the skeptic who doubts everything, Moore thought it was more rational to affirm knowledge of the world based on common sense and direct experience. Now, when we talk about philosophical problems, skepticism and certainty, Mooreanism directly addresses the skeptical challenge, which argue that we cannot have knowledge of the external world because we cannot rule out radical skeptical scenarios. Example, we might be brains invades. Now, Moore rejects the skepticism and claims that we can be certain of basic facts about the world, such as having hands or existing in a physical environment. The core problem for Mooreanism is the challenge of reconciling certainty in everyday knowledge with the skeptical challenge, which calls into question whether certainty and ordinary knowledge is possible at all. Now, what is the strength of Mooreanism? It is intuitive and practical. Moore's approach aligns with our ordinary intuitions and experiences. It is easier to affirm that we know we have hands than to engage in complex skeptical arguments. Now, Mooreanism directly confronts skepticism and refuses to yield to skeptical hypotheses. It provides a simple and bold refutation of radical skepticism. So, the common sense realism, where Moore's approach affirms the reliability of common sense and everyday knowledge, which many find attractive because it resists over-intellectualization of basic beliefs. So, Mooreanism has been a favorite of a lot of people, for they find it easier to connect, and something which is thus popularly also called as common sense realism. However, let's discuss the weaknesses of Mooreanism. The first is dogmatic. Critics argue that Moore's approach is dogmatic and lacks the sophistication required to address the complexity of skepticism. By simply asserting knowledge of ordinary things, Mooreanism does not offer a robust philosophical explanation of why we can be certain. The popularly something which is called as a Moorean paradox, where Moore's assertion that we can know both, that we have hands and that the skeptical hypothesis is false, seems contradictory. If Moore claims to know both, it leads to an internal conflict. It relies on ordinary intuitions, where Mooreanism is vulnerable to the charge that it relies too heavily on common sense and does not engage with deep philosophical analysis of skepticism. Now, in this background of Mooreanism, it is interesting to see what is Pritchard's response. Pritchard argues that Mooreanism fails to offer a true resolution to skepticism. While Moore's approach is appealing in its simplicity, it does not explain why the skeptic's challenge is flawed, or how we certainly can justify knowledge beyond ordinary experience. Mooreanism leaves critical questions unanswered about how we justify knowledge when confronted with skeptical arguments. So, Pritchard might suggest that a more sophisticated anti-skeptical approach like epistemological disjunctivism provides a better way forward. We will be discussing more of the other theories in details soon.